I'm Scott Bolton here with Dr. Emily Jenkins from the University of Saskatchewan. So, about 2 years ago, there was a surveillance team put together to kind of look at COVID for wildlife. I've heard that there's some results from that.
Yes. 2 years ago, we were still scrambling and not really sure where to start looking for SARS-CoV-2 outside of people. We knew that it probably originated in animals, and everybody was looking at mink because there had been some pretty famous outbreaks in mink farms. And nobody was really sure what would happen in North American wildlife. So it was a bit of a scramble to figure out where to start looking first. And we had some computer modeling studies that sort of suggested certain groups of animals might be higher risk. But it really wasn't until we started seeing data coming out of the northern US that suggested that white-tailed deer were good hosts that we turned our attention toward deer. And we found that in the fall of 2021, we were able to tap into existing programs for surveillance, actually for another wildlife disease that deer have, which is called chronic wasting disease. So we were very lucky in Saskatchewan that we already had this really robust program set up to test these heads that were harvested by hunters to look for chronic wasting disease. That also gave us a chance to swab the deer heads as they came in for SARS-CoV-2. And we were not completely shocked to find some positives because, of course, there have been some suggestive findings elsewhere and in Ontario that deer could be good hosts. But it was a pretty big day when we got our first positive, and we ended up finding 4 positives out of the 2021 hunting season.
So, what's that kind of look like for COVID in the deer population?
Yeah, it's a bit probably misleading to call it COVID because COVID is the expression of disease, and we're not actually sure disease is really part of this for deer. They potentially get a few respiratory signs, and some experimental infections showed that deer had some minor lung damage associated with infection, but we don't think they develop the same disease that people do. But it does seem like they are able to perpetuate the virus. And so initially we thought, oh, we're only going to look in deer around major urban centers because our idea was that humans were going to give this to deer. We were a bit shocked to discover that it was suggesting that that findings elsewhere were suggesting that deer themselves could transmit it amongst each other. And so that means that we could broaden our search, not just looking for those what we call spillover events from people to wildlife, but that wildlife themselves were probably being able to perpetuate the virus. And the big concern there is not so much that deer are directly going to give this back to people, because not too many people are out there kissing wild deer. The big concern is that the virus will circulate amongst deer and be able to mutate in this different wildlife host, and then maybe cross back into people in what would be very rare events, but could have significance if these viruses have mutated and escaped our ability to detect them in people and our ability to vaccinate against them.
So, is that kind of thing where it could go either way? Kind of like how Omicron is I guess some people would say it's a milder variant with more spread, whereas Delta is kind of a worse variant of the original strain. Is there kind of like a selection for that, or is it just all random pretty much?
No, that's a great question. With this totally emerging disease, it's really hard to make any generalizations, and I definitely don't know anything about it in human populations. But we know that when viruses are in an animal host versus a human host, they're under different selection pressures. So they're in a totally different environment. So that means that if, for example, SARS-CoV-2 in people is becoming more benign, which would be fantastic, um, that wouldn't happen if SARS-CoV-2 is able to escape and go off and be in the white-tailed deer for a while and then come back. So it would lose that march towards becoming more benign and possibly cross back with even more serious disease for people. And we don't have any evidence of that right now, but that's why we're doing this work, just to make sure that the virus isn't escaped out there in the population of deer and mutating in ways that would not be good if they cross back into people.
You mentioned that it could cause some respiratory problems for deer. Is there any kind of, I guess, worry at all for deer populations with this?
Um, so far, we have no evidence that naturally infected white-tailed deer actually show disease. So this was based on experimental infections. The actual real problem is if deer don't develop disease, if they're totally asymptomatic, happily wandering around little virus factories without actually causing any disease. And whether it's good or bad, white-tailed deer populations seem to be doing pretty well. So I don't think there's a conservation concern here. People will still have there will still be lots of deer around for people to hunt and harvest. And I do want to emphasize that we don't think that this finding suggests that people need to stop hunting, that the exposure that people would get through harvesting a deer, even if it did happen to be infected at the time, there is no evidence it's a foodborne disease, and there's a really minimal opportunity for hunters to be exposed while processing deer, and there are precautions they can take.
So is the team going to keep kind of gathering this data in the future coming years, I guess?
You bet. The plan is that we're going to keep up efforts not just locally in Saskatchewan, but also nationally to keep an eye on what's happening. Because, of course, wildlife don't respect borders, and so we need to know what's happening in deer populations on either side of us and all around us. And in Saskatchewan, we do have a really great engagement from our provincial government and from hunters themselves in providing these samples. So we're definitely going to keep this going. We want to know right now, it seems like it's a pretty low level of exposure in deer. Is that going to change? Is the virus itself going to change? So we definitely need to keep this going to be able to answer those questions.
All right. Is there anything else, Dolly, that you'd like to talk about?
Um, just just a reminder that wildlife are great, but we want to keep them wild. And so, although we don't think there's a big risk for people getting exposed from deer, let's not bait them, let's not feed them, let's not have unnecessary close interactions with them. Let's just enjoy them as wildlife from afar.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great talking with you.